Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hello and welcome back to the ISO Show. If you've been wondering where we've been for the last month or so, I've been travelling in Australia and Southeast Asia, and our communications manager, who is the amazing lady who organises all of these podcasts and recordings, she's also been travelling to Sweden and Norway. So I'm delighted that we're back in action on the ISO Show and fully refreshed after our travels. And it was interesting to see in certain countries how some organisations have got their ISO standards actually sign written as a badge of honour on the front of their buildings. So it brought a massive smile to my face as I was going along in a tuk-tuk in Thailand and seeing that. And great to see that standards are held in such high regard, not only in Southeast Asia but also in Australia too. But our guest today, Paul Simpson, he's not adverse to international exposure to ISO standards, as he's been involved in various technical committees associated with ISO standards over the years, including ISO 19011, where that was the standard for auditing, and ISO 17065 for product conformity as well. But today, he's going to be talking about Annex L. Some of you will be familiar with Annex SL, the framework, the foundation for new ISO standards now. Also, in context with TC 176, the technical committee for ISO 9001. So we'll be having a conversation around changes to ISO 9001. And some of you might be thinking, well, we've just had that. We've just managed the transition to ISO 9001-2015. But believe it or not, that standard is actually coming up for revision next year in 2020. So Paul will enlighten us and explain what's involved with that process and whether he thinks that there may be any potential future changes to ISO 9001. So welcome to Paul Simpson, who's the Director of Strategy to Action. Hello, Paul.
Hi, Mel. Thanks very much for inviting me on.
Great. I'm absolutely delighted that you've joined us. Paul, can you just begin by sharing with us a bit about your background in quality management, please?
Sure, will do. So I started off as a graduate mechanical engineer, but I've spent all my working life in quality in various forms. So I started off in quality control in a company called Pirelli, but making tyres. And then I've gone through sort of various roles within quality management for a range of companies, and have ended up picking up new responsibilities for, apart from quality management, for environment and for health and safety. And I've taken that sort of in those roles all the way through to the present day. And really, in the last 10 years or so, I've started to put some of that experience back into standards development. So working with BSI on a range of committees for UK standards, and then to a point where 18 months ago, BSI put me forward as the chair for ISO TC 176 Subcommittee 2, which is the subcommittee that's directly responsible for developing ISO 9001.
Great. And could you explain a bit about your role as Director at Strategy to Action as well?
Okay, so my day job is effectively providing support to organisations as a external consultant, so providing training, providing consultancy services, and also helping to do audits and also supporting the certification bodies and accreditation bodies with audits. So that's the bit that brings in the money. But as I say, a lot of my time is also spent volunteering for the likes of BSI and a couple of the professional institutes, so supporting membership organisations.
Okay, great. So before we delve into, well, what was formerly Annex SL, but is due to be Annex L, I believe, could you share with us something about you that not many people would know?
Oh, interesting. When I heard your introduction, I thought there's so many echoes with my past. So a little known fact about me was I was actually born in Zambia, in Africa. So my father was a mining engineer, yeah, so he worked on the copper mines out in Zambia. And I think that has led to a little bit of a wanderlust. So I'm a bit of a traveller myself. And when you were talking about the highlighting of standards in Southeast Asia, it brought back some fond memories of seeing, not so much in Thailand from a tuk-tuk, but certainly in India and in Egypt, various people promoting their 9001 certification.
Yes. So obviously that's stood you in good stead for chairing this technical committee. So so that's something I'm really keen to find out a little bit more about then, Paul. So could you explain what Annex L is, first of all, please?
Yes, and it is one of the areas where we are starting to get used to the idea that it is Annex L rather than Annex SL. And again, just for the benefit of your subscribers, the change in designation from Annex SL to Annex L really reflects the change in importance of the common text and core high-level structure of the annex. So it's become closer to the centre. It's now being adopted by both the IEC, which is the International Technical Commission, as well as ISO for all the management system standards that people use. And since its publication back in 2012, it has got highlighted importance for standards users, as those implementing the requirements of any of the core management system standards, such as ISO 9001, ISO 14001, and most recently in terms of publication, ISO 45001. And the work on Annex L is ongoing, but I'd like to give your drivers a little bit of information about where that's going and how TC 176 Subcommittee 2 is trying to influence the development of that.
Yes. So before we go any further, some people that are new to standards will be wondering what the L actually means in Annex L. Could you just explain what that is?
Again, nothing dramatic about that. It's just a point within the ISO directives where they've slotted it in. So there are, as you may guess, a number of other annexes, and Annex L is just the section that relates to management system standards and the core text and the common structure.
I see. So in time, will Annex L supersede Annex SL, for those that are familiar with Annex SL?
Yes, it has done already. So this one went under the wire a little bit, but certainly the last revision of the ISO directives, the annex had moved. So from SL to L.
Good. So we're all up to speed on that then. Great. Okay.
It sounds a little bit geeky, yeah, I'm afraid, but it is something that I say your listeners will have to get used to.
Yes, yeah. So TC 176. So TC stands for Technical Committee. What is 176 all about then, Paul? Could you give us a bit of background and just explain a bit of the context and what role TC 176 plays?
Excellent, yes. So when ISO was formed back in 1946, it had its first technical committee, and forgive me, I can't remember the actual scope of application of that TC. So there is a TC1, and TC 176, unsurprisingly, is the 176th committee that ISO formed with a remit, in our case, dealing with all aspects of quality management. So you can tell from the numbering systems that TC207 for 14001 was a little bit later, and PC, and now TC283, which is for ISO 45001, is that bit later on. So we're now up into the TC300s, but 176 was the 176th committee that ISO formed.
Okay. Great. So could you just provide a bit of context about TC 176 and what your role is and what the latest information is around TC 176?
Yeah, sure. So I say we were formed in 1979. I can say I haven't been around that long, but I am in a long line of UK chairs of Subcommittee 2. But actually, it's not that long a line. So when TC 176 was formed, BSI in the UK was given chair of Subcommittee 2, which is the subcommittee that develops ISO 9001. And my predecessors were Dr. John Davis and Dr. Nigel Croft. So those two gentlemen have preceded me in the role of chair of Subcommittee 2 and have led all of the development of ISO 9001 since it was first published in 1987.
Okay. And so what are the future concepts for ISO 9001?
Okay, so Subcommittee 2, as part of TC 176, has responsibility for 1001, as well as 1004 and the 10,000 series standards. But our prime role is to make sure that all of the standards that we produce reflect the needs of the users of quality management standards. So apart from now forming our standards around Annex L, we also look at developments in the marketplace for ISO 9001 and in particular the interested parties for ISO 9001 and the TC 176. So we look at the users, and that's both the people that buy the standard, the companies that structure their quality management systems to meet the requirements of ISO 9001, and also the significant user groups. So we look at the customers of the companies that go for certification. We also look at the end users and the consumers and say, what is it that they need from a requirement standard such as ISO 9001? And a lot of the work that I'm doing at the moment is trying to get closer to those groups. So in terms of sectors, it's sectors like healthcare, defence, automotive, aerospace, to understand what it is that they need, both as organisations that will implement their systems around ISO 9001 and those that expect their suppliers to conform to the requirements of ISO 9001. And that's a really interesting process.
So you mentioned a couple of sectors there, such as aerospace and automotive, but they do have their own quality standard, don't they, or standards, such as AS 9100 and the TS standards. So I guess my question is it more important for them to have ISO 9001 or for them to have their own specific quality standard?
In their case, they have effectively a dual role. So what they do is they subscribe entirely to ISO 9001, and then they have additional requirements for the sector. So just taking the IATF as an example, when they were working alongside TC 176, they had ISO TS 16949, which included all of the text of ISO 9001. Now they've taken a slightly different approach. So they've said, rather than follow exactly standard development cycle that ISO follows, they reserve the right to sort of change their document outside of the revision cycle for ISO 9001. But what they do is they refer entirely to the text of ISO 9001.
Right, okay. And so on the subject of different industries, are there any trends at all that you've seen for certain industries to adopt ISO 9001?
No, again, one of the things we have found with sort of million plus organisations that become certified to 9001, and that's our sort of strongest indicator of the breadth of coverage of the standard, is that they come from all walks of life. So the sectors I mentioned, things like healthcare and pharmaceuticals, aerospace, oil and gas, have all adopted ISO 9001 as being the core standard for quality management. The trends are more difficult to pick up in terms of where ISO 9001 might be adopted most next, but we're certainly keeping our eye on the users of and their perceptions of 9001 as standard.
And I can just speak from our point of view at Blackmores, and obviously we get inquiries about implementing various standards. 9001 obviously still the most popular standard, but it's interesting to see certain sectors that are interested in 9001 that may not necessarily have been in the past, such as charities, and also increasingly more in the IT sector as well as obviously the traditional, manufacturing, construction and other types of industries. So in terms of the representatives on TC 176, is that, covering different industry types as well, or is it predominantly quality professionals such as yourself? I was just wondering, how is that committee made up, Paul?
It's a wide mixture. So the prime focus for ISO for each of its technical committees is representation from the national standards bodies. So to form a technical committee, ISO goes out to its members, the national standards bodies, and asks them whether they would like a new technical committee established. So they ask the question, and then they ask the countries, the national standards bodies, is this something that you will support? So for 9001, for example, it's something like 90 odd countries who are participating members within TC 176 and or its subcommittees. So once they've decided that they support it, they put forward their technical experts, and they are the ones responsible for deciding who is expert in their field for quality management. So we have a mixture of different ranges of industries from those participants. They come from food, they come from tourism, they come from manufacturing, they come from service, and as well as profit and not-for-profit. And that gives us a really rich mix of different views for the standard.
Excellent. That's what we need, isn't it? Because at the end of the day, it's a standard for any type of organisation, isn't it, regardless of size or sector?
Exactly. And a lot of the national standards bodies try and do that with the mix of experts that they send to ISO TC 176. So, for example, UK, who I used to represent as an expert, and I now represent as a chair, which is an impartial role, send people from large organisations, consultancy type organisations, manufacturing organisations, and even representatives of small businesses. So it's a very powerful mix when you get those people into a room.
So I can't believe that the standard was last published in 2015 and already the review is just around the corner in 2020.
It's amazing.
Time goes so quickly, doesn't it? So could you just explain to us what's involved with that review process and how long does it take, and when are we likely to see a new version of 9001, if we do see a new version of 9001?
Yes, that isn't a given. So 9001, like all ISO standards, goes through a standard ISO review process. So every 5 years following publication, all full ISO standards come up for review. And in that process, TC 176 will send notification round to all its national standards bodies and liaison members to ask them what they think of the standard in its current edition, whether there is a need for change, and if so, what changes they think should be made, and then ask the countries to vote on whether the standard should be retained as is, revised, amended, or withdrawn in theory. But in practice, for a standard as influential as ISO 9001, most of the participating national standards bodies will either say confirm it as is, as in leave it alone, or revise. And it's likely that even though we've had a fairly significant change for the 2015 edition, there will still be a vote from the national standards bodies to revise. One of the reasons for that is, as I mentioned, Annex L, which is the core of 9001, is itself going through a revision process currently, and it's likely that the publication of the revised Annex L will come up at the same time as the TC 176 review goes out. So all the participating national standards bodies will look at that and will say, well, because Annex L is revised, we need to now revise 91.
So what kind of timelines are we looking at then, do you think?
So the review for 9001 comes up 5 years after publication, which will be in September 2020. Within TC 176, we're already making some preparations for that, and I think we'll come on to some of the future concept work that is ongoing. But we're preparing to ask the question of the national standards bodies. Once the review is sent out, that's a fairly formal process, requires some time for the standards bodies to think about those changes and to report back. So it's typically around 6 months. At the end of that, we will collate the information that comes back. And again, assuming there is a recommendation for revision, we will then start up the work in TC 176 to revise the standard. And typically we're working for a 2-year period. So you're talking about a revision for 9001 being out in around 2022, 2023.
Okay, so we've got a bit of time yet.
There is a little.
Yes. So in your view, do you think there are likely to be any changes to 9001? And if so, what could you see those potentially being?
I mean, certainly all the changes that Annex L has will come through into 9001. And because it is the core of all management system standards, we are required to adopt that unless we can make a very strong case for it not applying to quality management and other requirement standards like ISO 9001. Other than that, the main areas that the Future Concepts group within TC176 as a whole are looking at some of the technologies that are changing within our world of work. So things like artificial intelligence and blockchain and Internet of Things, and just seeing what implications, if any, they create for quality management. And it's really only when we have that full picture together that we'll be able to say, and this is the future direction for 9001.
Okay, good. So before we wrap up, Paul, would you like to leave us with a favourite quote?
Oh, I'd love to. There's a few that I really do identify with, but one that's always close to my heart, and it's very true for quality management, is the one from the management guru, Peter Drucker, where he's saying the purpose of business is to find and keep a customer. And that always rings true for me as a quality management professional. We have to look after our customers and make sure that we provide to them suits their purposes.
Absolutely. Very simple, but very, very strong message there, isn't it? And I can remember covering Drucker as part of a total quality management course, and I'd forgotten all about that actually. And yeah, that is a great quote. Well, thank you for joining us, Paul, today. And thank you for joining Paul Simpson and I on the ISO show today. Paul, how can listeners find out about how to contact you at Strategy to Action?
Well, firstly, thank you very much for inviting me, Mel. It's been a pleasure talking to you and hopefully passing on a little bit of information to your subscribers. It's a really exciting time for me and for TC176, and I hope for your listeners as well. I'd be happy to field any questions or call. The best way of getting hold of me is my direct email, which is paul@s2a2s.com. Otherwise, if you can try and find me on LinkedIn, and I can point you in the direction of the TC176 Subcommittee 2 LinkedIn group, where we're discussing matters related to all things ISO 9001. So very pleased to answer any questions.
Great. We'll also include those details on the ISO show notes on the Blackmores website. So if you're driving along or commuting, listening to this podcast show and you haven't got a pen and paper handy, those contact details will be available on blackmoresuk.com, obviously where you can subscribe to the podcast. Well, I look forward to catching up with all our ISO show listeners on the next.